If you are listening to this, take a deep breath, because what I am about to tell you proves that sometimes the people most willing to stab you in the back are not hiding in the shadows. They are sitting right at your Thanksgiving dinner table. My name is Richard. 3 weeks before the holiday, my daughter-in-law demanded my 72-year-old wife cook a 16-dish feast completely alone. But the dark, calculated truth behind that menu was so cold-blooded that instead of turning on the oven, I turned on my phone, booked first-class tickets to Hawaii, and destroyed their lives from 30,000 feet in the air. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I have spent my entire life building things from the ground up. For 40 years, I worked as a civil engineer in the harsh, unforgiving weather of Chicago. I know concrete, I know steel, and I know exactly how much pressure a foundation can take before it cracks. I am 75 years old now, and I thought my days of analyzing stress fractures were far behind me. My wife Martha and I had earned our quiet retirement. She is 72 years old, a retired pediatric nurse who spent 3.5 decades walking hospital corridors, comforting terrified parents, and holding the hands of sick children. Together we built a beautiful life. We live in a spacious, fully paid-off home in the suburbs worth about $1.2 million. We do not have mortgages hanging over our heads, and we do not owe a single cent to anyone. We live quietly, we tend to our garden, and we enjoy the peace that comes from a lifetime of honest, backbreaking labor. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when you have family members who view your stability as a resource to be exploited. The disruption to our lives did not come with a loud crash. It came on a quiet Saturday morning, exactly 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had woken up early, as I always do, to brew a pot of coffee. The house was silent, wrapped in the cold frost of late autumn. When I walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Martha reading her morning devotional, I stopped dead in my tracks. She was sitting at the kitchen island, staring down at the glowing screen of her tablet. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying silently and heavily, the way someone cries when they have been deeply humiliated but do not want to make a sound. I rushed over to her, my heart hammering in my chest. I asked her what was wrong, if someone had passed away, or if she was in pain. Martha did not say a word. She just pushed the tablet across the marble countertop toward me. I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked at the screen. It was an email from our daughter-in-law, Stephanie. The subject line was written in all capital letters. It read, "Thanksgiving menu and schedule must be ready by 4 p.m. I scrolled down, and with every line I read, I felt a cold, hard knot of pure anger tightening in my stomach. It was a list of 16 highly complex gourmet dishes. It asked for a truffle butter roasted turkey, individual beef, Wellingtons, hand-rolled artisan pasta, 4 different types of intricate fruit tarts, and a series of appetizers that would take a professional kitchen staff an entire day to prepare. But it was not just the food that made my blood boil. It was the tone. There was no greeting. There was no please. There was no thank you. It was a list of demands written with the arrogant authority of a plantation owner barking orders at a servant. At the bottom of the email, Stephanie had added a final paragraph. It read, "Martha, you need to arrive at our house by 5:30 a.m. to begin prep work. I will not have time to help you because I will be busy styling the dining room and getting myself ready to receive the guests. Do not mess this up. Everything must be plated perfectly. This dinner is absolutely critical for our social standing, and I expect everything to be flawless." I stood there in my kitchen reading those words over and over again, trying to comprehend the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the woman who had married my son. My hands began to shake, not from age, but from a quiet, terrifying rage. I looked down at my wife. Martha was wiping her eyes with a paper towel, looking small and defeated. Martha has severe rheumatoid arthritis. The years of lifting patients and rushing around hospital wards had taken a brutal toll on her body. Her knees ache constantly, and her wrists swell up so badly on cold mornings that sometimes she cannot even open a jar of jam without help. She takes heavy medication just to manage the daily pain. Standing on a hard kitchen floor for 10 hours chopping, roasting, and kneading pasta for 15 people was not just an unreasonable request, it was physically impossible. It was a medical hazard. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth as I thought about Thomas and Stephanie. My son Thomas is 45 years old. He works as a mid-level corporate manager, but he walks around with the inflated ego of a billionaire CEO. He is deeply insecure, always desperate to prove to the world that he is wealthier and more important than he actually is. Stephanie, who is 40, is the perfect enabler for his delusions. She has not worked a real job in over a decade. She calls herself an aspiring tech founder and spends her days going to expensive lunches, wearing designer clothes, and trying to climb the social ladder. They live in a massive, gaudy house they clearly cannot afford, driving leased European SUVs while their credit cards are maxed out to the limit. Over the last 5 years, their relationship with us had deteriorated into a transactional nightmare. They only ever called us when they needed something. They called when they wanted free babysitting so they could go on weekend getaways. They called when they needed small loans to cover emergency expenses, loans that were conveniently forgotten and never repaid. They treated us not as parents, but as a safety net, an ATM, and a free labor service. And now they were treating my wife like a disposable kitchen maid. I reached out, gently closed the cover of the tablet, and slid it away from Martha. I knelt down beside her chair and took her swollen, aching hands in mine. I looked her straight in the eyes and told her that she was absolutely not doing this. I told her that she had spent her entire life serving others, raising our son, and caring for our home, and I would be damned if I let a lazy, entitled woman treat her like unpaid help. Martha sniffled and tried to force a smile, telling me she did not want to cause drama, that it was just a dinner, and maybe she could just prep some things in advance. But I shook my head. I told her the discussion was over. I was going to handle this. I stood up, pulled my phone from my pocket, and walked out to the back porch. The morning air was biting, but I barely felt it. I dialed Thomas's number. As the phone rang, I prepared myself for his reaction. I expected him to be embarrassed. I expected him to apologize profusely, to claim that Stephanie had sent the email without thinking, or that it was some kind of massive misunderstanding. Thomas answered on the 4th ring. He sounded groggy, as if I had woken him up even though it was already past 8 in the morning. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what I had read. I told him about the absurd demands, the disrespectful tone, and the physical impossibility of his mother standing in a kitchen for 10 hours. I demanded an explanation. Instead of an apology, I heard a long, dramatic sigh on the other end of the line. It was a sigh designed to make me feel like I was a burdensome, unreasonable old man. When Thomas finally spoke, his tone was dripping with patronizing exhaustion. He told me to calm down and stop blowing things out of proportion. He immediately began to weave a narrative of victimhood, playing the mental health card with practiced precision. He claimed that Stephanie was suffering from severe anxiety and depression. He said she was under an immense amount of pressure trying to keep up with the holiday season, and that her mental state was incredibly fragile. He painted her as a struggling, overwhelmed woman who was just trying to create a perfect holiday memory. Then he turned his manipulation toward me. He accused me of being overly sensitive and inflexible. He told me that I was making a big deal out of a simple request, and that I was trying to sabotage their Thanksgiving. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of desperate pleading. He said, "Dad, you know how fragile she is right now. If you say no, she will have a nervous breakdown. Do you really want to be the reason your daughter-in-law ends up in the hospital? Why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" I stood on the porch, gripping the wooden railing so hard, my knuckles turned white. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He was trying to make me feel guilty for protecting my disabled wife from being exploited. He was weaponizing modern buzzwords about mental health to justify pure, unadulterated selfishness. But I did not back down. I told him that depression does not excuse treating an elderly woman like a slave. I told him that if Stephanie wanted a 16-course gourmet meal, she could hire a catering company. That is when Thomas dropped the final part of his lie. The perfect emotionally manipulative excuse designed specifically to trap my wife. He changed his tone again, shifting from defensive to sorrowful. He told me that the dinner was not just for them. He claimed that Stephanie's parents were flying in from Boston for the holiday. Stephanie comes from a very wealthy, high-society family. Her parents are notoriously judgmental and demanding. Thomas explained that Stephanie always felt inferior to her mother, and she was terrified of being criticized. Then he delivered the killing blow. He said Mom's cooking is the only thing that feels like real family love, Dad. Stephanie just wants her parents to experience Mom's amazing food. She looks up to Mom so much. She thinks Mom is the only one who can make the dinner feel warm and authentic. It is an honor, really. Stephanie is just too stressed to express it properly. Please, Dad. We need Mom to do this. Just this once. For family. I did not know it at the time, but Martha had quietly opened the back door and stepped onto the porch behind me. She had heard the entire conversation. Martha has a heart of absolute gold. She is the kind of woman who will give you the coat off her back if she thinks you are cold. Hearing her son pleading, hearing that her cooking was viewed as a symbol of real family love, completely melted her defenses. She stepped forward, gently touched my arm, and looked up at me with pleading eyes. She whispered softly, "Richard, I will do it. It is for family. If the poor girl is struggling that much, I can manage. I will take extra pain medication. Let it go." I looked at my wife, seeing the pure, unconditional love in her eyes, and I felt trapped. I hated every single second of it. I knew Thomas was manipulating us. I knew Stephanie was using us. But I also knew that if I fought Thomas on this, I would be fighting Martha too. I would be breaking her heart and causing a massive family rift that would ruin the holidays for her. I took a deep breath, swallowing the bitter taste of resentment. I spoke into the phone, my voice flat and cold. I told Thomas that Martha had agreed, but that I would be coming with her at dawn to help, and that if Stephanie spoke to my wife with even a hint of disrespect, we would walk out instantly. Thomas let out a loud, relieved laugh. He quickly agreed, thanking me profusely, telling me how much he loved us and how perfect everything was going to be. He hung up the phone, sounding victorious. He thought he had won. He thought the two clueless, accommodating old parents had been successfully brought to heel. Martha smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and went back inside to start making a grocery list. I stayed on the porch, staring out at the frost-covered lawn. The cold wind bit at my face, but my mind was entirely focused on the conversation I had just had. In my 40 years of inspecting blueprints and structural supports, I learned that a building does not collapse all at once. It gives you warning signs. A hairline fracture in the concrete, a door that stops closing properly, a subtle shift in the weight distribution. You just have to be paying attention. As I stood there, my analytical brain began to dissect Thomas's story, pulling it apart piece by piece. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the foundation of his lie was completely rotten. There was a glaring, massive flaw in his story. I stepped back into the warmth of the kitchen, closing the heavy glass door behind me to shut out the freezing autumn wind. The sudden silence of the house pressed against my ears. Martha was still sitting at the kitchen island, hunched over a blank notepad, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She held a pen in her right hand, but it was not moving. She was just staring at the paper, trying to figure out how to mathematically orchestrate a 16-dish culinary marathon. I stood leaning against the doorframe, watching the woman I had loved for half a century, and felt a profound, heavy sorrow wash over my initial anger. I looked closely at her hands. Those hands had bathed our son when he was a fragile newborn. Those hands had expertly administered medicine to thousands of frightened children during her 35 years, working the overnight shift in the pediatric ward. Now those same hands were swollen and trembling, betraying the painful reality of her daily physical struggle. Martha suffers from a severe, aggressive form of rheumatoid arthritis. It is a cruel disease that attacks the joints, turning the simple act of waking up into a painful ordeal. On her worst days, her knees flare up with such intense inflammation that walking down our carpeted hallway requires a slow, agonizing effort. Her wrists bear the brunt of the damage. The cartilage has worn dangerously thin, leaving bone grinding against bone. We have a collection of custom braces and compression gloves scattered throughout the house just to help her manage the baseline pain. Her doctor had been incredibly clear during her last rheumatology appointment. He warned her that prolonged periods of physical exertion, especially standing on hard surfaces or performing repetitive manual tasks, could trigger irreversible joint damage. Yet here was our daughter-in-law demanding that a 72-year-old woman with a compromised autoimmune system stand on a rigid kitchen floor for 10 consecutive hours. Stephanie wanted Martha to hand-roll fresh artisan pasta. She wanted her to individually fold and bake beef Wellingtons, a process that requires immense upper body strength to roll out chilled puff pastry. She expected her to repeatedly lift a 20-pound turkey in and out of a blistering hot oven to baste it with truffle butter. Doing all of this alone without any assistance was not just a selfish request. It was a medically dangerous demand that could easily land my wife in the emergency room with a severe arthritic flare-up. Stephanie knew about Martha's condition. Thomas knew about his mother's condition. They just did not care. To them, her physical pain was an acceptable sacrifice for their social vanity. As I watched Martha slowly begin to write down ingredients, pressing the pen awkwardly between her stiff fingers, a flood of memories from the past 5 years rushed into my mind. I thought about how Thomas and Stephanie had systematically discarded us, treating us less like parents and more like a convenient free utility service. They lived in a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion in a gated community that was completely out of their financial league. The house had a 3-car garage, which they filled with top-of-the-line leased European sport utility vehicles. They wore designer clothes with conspicuous logos, dined at exclusive restaurants, and posted endless pictures of their luxurious lifestyle on social media. But behind that carefully curated facade of wealth, there was a glaring, hollow reality. They were bleeding cash, and we were always the ones expected to provide the bandages. Our phone only ever rang when they needed something. Instead, the phone would ring late on a Friday afternoon because they had secured last-minute tickets to a gala and needed free babysitting for the weekend. We would drop everything, drive across town, and care for our grandchildren while they drank champagne with people they were desperately trying to impress. Then came the requests for money. Thomas would call asking for a small loan to cover a sudden, unexpected expense. It was always framed as a temporary cash flow issue. A few $1,000s here for a broken heater, a few thousand there to cover a gap in Stephanie's business venture. We always wrote the check because we loved our son. And every single time those loans were quietly forgotten. They never paid us back a single dime, and we never asked. They took our money, they took our time, and they took our love, offering absolutely nothing but condescension in return. Stephanie had not worked a real paying job in over a decade. She spent her days attending Pilates classes, browsing upscale boutiques, and calling herself a visionary entrepreneur without ever launching a viable product. The idea that this woman who spent her life avoiding hard work felt entitled to order my exhausted, ailing wife to act as her unpaid kitchen servant was a level of disrespect I could no longer tolerate. They had crossed an invisible boundary. They had mistaken our quiet generosity for pathetic weakness. I walked across the kitchen floor, my footsteps deliberate and heavy. I stopped right next to Martha's chair. She looked up at me, her eyes weary, a forced brave smile trembling on her lips. She had just written down the words "fresh truffles and puff pastry" on the top line of the notepad. I reached out and gently took the pen from her stiff fingers. I set it down on the counter and then closed the notepad. Martha looked at me with mild confusion, her brow furrowed. She told me she needed to finish the list so we could beat the holiday rush at the specialty grocery store. I placed my hands on her shoulders, looking down at the woman who had given me the best years of her life. I spoke with a voice that left absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. I told her she was not going to the grocery store. I told her she was not going to buy truffles, she was not going to roll out pastry dough, and she was certainly not going to stand in Stephanie's kitchen for 10 hours to cook a feast for people who did not respect her. Martha's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to immediately protest. She repeated that she had to just do it for the family to keep the peace. I shook my head slowly, feeling the unyielding resolve harden inside me. I told her that she had spent 35 years healing sick children, raising a son, and building a home. I told her that her worth was not defined by her ability to endure pain for the sake of our son's fragile ego. I would not allow her to be treated like a disposable catering service for a woman who viewed us as nothing more than props. The phone call was a lie, the vegan parents were a lie, and this entire Thanksgiving operation was a trap. I pulled her into a close protective hug, holding her gently, and I whispered softly into her ear that we were finally done being discarded. And it was a flaw that told me this Thanksgiving dinner had absolutely nothing to do with family, and everything to do with a deception, so deep I could not yet see the bottom of it. I stood frozen on the frost-covered wooden planks of my back porch, the cold wind whipping against my face. My mind raced back through every single word my son had just spoken. He had claimed that his wife Stephanie was planning this massive 16-dish gourmet feast specifically to impress her wealthy, high-society parents visiting from Boston. He had sold me a story of a vulnerable, anxious woman desperate for her mother's approval. But the menu Stephanie had demanded Martha cook featured truffle butter, roasted turkey beef, Wellingtons, and heavy artisan tarts. Stephanie's parents are strict vegans. They are also severe diabetics who monitor every ounce of sugar they consume. I remembered this vividly because at Thomas and Stephanie's wedding, a special catering team had to be hired just to accommodate their incredibly strict dietary restrictions. They would never touch a butter-basted turkey. They would never eat a beef Wellington. The entire premise of the dinner was a complete fabrication. Thomas had lied to my face using his mother's unconditional love as a weapon to secure her free labor. I could not let this stand. I refused to let Martha sacrifice her physical health and endure excruciating joint pain for a fraudulent event. I pulled my phone out of my pocket once more. My thumb hovered over my son's name. I dialed his number again, demanding a real explanation. I expected Thomas to act surprised, maybe to apologize and claim Stephanie had sent the menu list without thinking about her parents' dietary needs. I thought he might finally break down and tell me the truth. He answered on the second ring. His voice carried an immediate tone of irritation, as if my very existence was an unbearable inconvenience to his busy schedule. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with the firm, unyielding authority of a father who knows he is being deceived. I asked him directly about the menu. I pointed out the glaring contradiction between a meat-heavy, sugar-laden feast and his in-law's strict vegan and diabetic diets. I asked him who this dinner was actually for, because it certainly was not for Stephanie's parents. I waited for his defense. Instead of stammering or apologizing, Thomas answered with an exhausted, patronizing tone that made my blood run cold. He completely ignored my question about the vegan diet. He immediately pivoted, launching into a heavily rehearsed defensive strategy. He played the mental health and stress cards with ruthless efficiency. He spoke to me slowly, articulating his words as if he were explaining a simple concept to a stubborn toddler. He claimed that Stephanie was suffering from severe anxiety and crippling depression trying to keep up with the holidays. He said that her mental state was deteriorating by the hour, and that my constant questioning was only making things worse. He painted a picture of a household on the brink of collapse, completely blaming the tension on the societal pressures of the season. He told me that Stephanie was not thinking clearly about the menu because her mind was so clouded by panic and the desperate need to create a perfect atmosphere. He insisted that the specifics of the food did not matter, only the act of providing a grand dinner mattered to her fragile psyche. He continued his manipulation tactics without taking a single breath. He argued that I was being overly sensitive and inflexible about the whole situation. He tried to turn the blame onto me, suggesting that my protective nature over Martha was actually a selfish attempt to ruin their holiday. He spoke with a sense of aggressive victimhood, claiming that I had never truly supported Stephanie, and that I was always looking for reasons to criticize her choices. He said that my refusal to just go along with the plan was a deliberate act of sabotage against his marriage. Then came the ultimate guilt trip. His voice cracked slightly, a theatrical display of emotion designed to break my resolve. He begged me not to cause any more drama. He pleaded with me to just let it go and allow Martha to cook the meal as requested. He delivered his final calculated line with chilling precision. He said, "Dad, you know how fragile she is right now. If you say no, she will have a breakdown." I stood there in absolute silence, listening to the hollow echo of his words through the phone receiver. I realized in that exact moment that the boy I had raised was completely gone. He had been consumed by the toxic vanity of his lifestyle. He was actively gaslighting his own father to protect a lie he refused to acknowledge. He was perfectly willing to risk his elderly mother's physical well-being just to maintain the illusion of control and wealth. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not about a menu anymore. This was a battle for respect, dignity, and survival against my own flesh and blood. I did not argue with him. I did not yell. I simply told him that we would see them on Thanksgiving morning, and then I ended the call. I lowered the phone, the cold metal biting into my palm. I knew then that I could not trust a single word that came out of his mouth. If he was willing to lie about something as fundamental as the guests attending his dinner, he was hiding something much larger and far more dangerous. My gut feeling had evolved into absolute certainty. I turned around and looked through the glass door into the kitchen. Martha was still sitting there, rubbing her swollen wrists, preparing to sacrifice herself for a family that viewed her as nothing more than a convenient appliance. I made a silent promise to her right then and there. I was going to uncover the exact truth behind this ridiculous 16-course feast. I was going to find out exactly who Thomas and Stephanie were really trying to impress, and I was going to dismantle their entire operation piece by piece. I slowly walked back inside the house, my mind shifting gears from a grieving, deeply disappointed father into a cold, highly meticulous investigator. I gently told Martha to put the notepad away and go rest her aching hands. I told her I had a very important errand to run in the city. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter, slipped on my heavy winter coat, and walked out the front door. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, my vision locked entirely on the long, cold road ahead. The time for asking gentle questions had definitively passed. It was time for secret, calculated action. I was going to pay a quiet visit to my old friend Mitchell, and together we were going to relentlessly dig up every single skeleton my son had so desperately tried to hide and bury. But to fully understand why I was so absolutely certain of his deception, you have to understand the final, most crucial thread of the web Thomas had spun before I hung up that phone. You have to understand the perfect excuse he deployed to break his mother's resistance. During that agonizing phone conversation, right after he had tried to weaponize Stephanie's supposed mental health struggles, Thomas had paused. He had let a heavy, calculated silence hang in the air, creating a dramatic vacuum that he knew would draw us in. Then his tone shifted from defensive frustration to a deep, sorrowful vulnerability. He told me that the massive Thanksgiving dinner was not actually just for them. He revealed what he claimed was the true, hidden purpose behind the ridiculous 16-dish menu. He said that Stephanie's parents were flying in from Boston for the holiday weekend. Stephanie comes from an old established family in Massachusetts. Her parents are wealthy, high society people who measure a person's worth by their zip code, the brand of their watch, and the exclusivity of their country club membership. They are the kind of people who hire professional interior designers just to decorate their living room for a casual cocktail party. Thomas explained that Stephanie had always felt a crushing sense of inferiority when it came to her parents. She felt that nothing she ever did was quite good enough to meet their impossible standards. According to Thomas, her mother was particularly judgmental, always finding minor flaws in Stephanie's home, her wardrobe, and her lifestyle choices. Thomas painted a vivid picture of a daughter, desperately seeking the approval of a cold, demanding mother. He said that Stephanie was terrified of this upcoming visit. She wanted to prove to her parents that she had built a beautiful, successful, and cultured life. But she knew that if she hired a catering company, her mother would immediately dismiss it as a lazy, superficial gesture. Her mother would see right through the facade of hired help and criticize her for not creating a genuine, warm, inviting home environment. Then Thomas delivered the most manipulative, poisonous piece of flattery I have ever heard in my 75 years of life. His voice softened, adopting a tone of pure, reverent admiration. He said that my wife's cooking was the only thing that felt like real, authentic family love. He told me that Stephanie looked up to Martha so much, viewing her as the ultimate matriarch who knew how to bind a family together with warmth and tradition. Thomas insisted that Stephanie just wanted her parents to experience Martha's amazing food because it represented the kind of genuine, loving household that Stephanie had always craved but never experienced in rigid Boston. He framed the outrageous demand not as an insult, but as an incredible honor. He made it sound as though Stephanie was humbly asking her mother-in-law to step in and save her from the harsh judgment of her own parents. He said that Stephanie believed Martha was the only person in the world who could make the dinner feel warm, authentic, and truly special. It was a perfectly designed psychological trap. If we refused to help, we were not just saying no to a menu. We were saying no to a desperate, anxious woman who was begging for maternal warmth and protection against her own cruel family. I knew it was a lie. My mind immediately recognized the absolute absurdity of the situation. As I mentioned before, Stephanie's parents are strict vegans and severe diabetics. They would never eat a butter-basted turkey or a pastry-heavy beef Wellington. The menu itself proved that Thomas was lying right through his teeth. But the massive problem was not what I knew. The problem was what Martha heard. I had placed the phone on speaker when the call began, wanting Martha to hear exactly how her son was going to explain his wife's disrespectful behavior. I watched my wife as Thomas spun his elaborate tale of a daughter seeking love and approval. Martha has a heart of absolute gold. She spent her entire career as a pediatric nurse, dedicating her life to comforting those who were in pain. She possesses a well of empathy that is so deep that it sometimes blinds her to the malicious intentions of others. Hearing her son pleading with such apparent sincerity, hearing that her cooking was viewed as the ultimate symbol of real, unconditional family love, completely bypassed her logic and went straight to her heart. I saw the tension leave her shoulders. I saw the righteous anger fade from her eyes, replaced instantly by a soft maternal concern. She forgot about her swollen, aching wrists. She forgot about the rheumatoid arthritis that made standing a daily torture. All she heard was that her family needed her to provide comfort and warmth. She stepped forward, closing the distance between us on the cold wooden planks of the back porch. She gently reached out and wrapped her stiff, trembling fingers around my forearm. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with gentle, unconditional, sacrificing love. She whispered softly, her voice barely carrying over the autumn wind. She said she would do it. She told me she could manage the pain, that it was for family, and that we could not leave the poor girl to face her judgmental parents completely alone. In that moment, and I felt a suffocating sense of defeat. I looked down at my beautiful, selfless wife, and I knew that if I continued to fight Thomas on the phone, I would be fighting her as well. I would be destroying the delicate illusion of family harmony that she was so desperate to preserve. Thomas had successfully weaponized his mother's best qualities against her. He had used her boundless empathy as a tool to secure free, grueling labor, to protect Martha's heart and to prevent a massive emotional conflict that would only cause her more distress. I made the tactical decision to surrender the immediate battle. I took a deep breath, swallowing the bitter metallic taste of absolute resentment. I spoke into the phone, my voice flat, hollow, and devoid of any warmth. I told Thomas that we would do it. I told him that Martha had agreed to cook the meal, but I insisted that I would be coming with her at dawn to assist with the heavy physical lifting. The transformation on the other end of the line was instantaneous. The sorrowful, vulnerable tone vanished entirely, replaced by a loud, boisterous laugh of pure relief. Thomas quickly agreed to my condition, thanking me profusely. He practically tripped over his own words as he told us how much he loved us and how absolutely perfect everything was going to be. He hung up the phone with the swift, eager energy of a man who had just successfully executed a brilliant scam. He sounded entirely victorious as the phone line went completely dead. I stood there on the cold wooden planks of the back porch, staring at the darkened screen of my phone. The line was completely dead, but the echo of my son's victorious laughter seemed to linger in the freezing autumn air. Thomas thought he had won. He truly believed he had masterfully manipulated his elderly parents into submission using his wife's fragile mental state and the desperate need to impress her wealthy parents as the perfect, unbreakable shield. But as the initial wave of defeat began to settle, my mind, trained by 40 years of structural engineering, began to do what it does best. It began to look for the stress points. It began to examine the load-bearing walls of the story Thomas had just constructed. And it did not take long for me to find the fatal flaw. I walked over to the edge of the porch, leaning my weight against the railing. I closed my eyes and cast my memory back to Thomas and Stephanie's wedding day. It had been a lavish, ridiculously expensive affair at a country club paid for mostly by us because Stephanie's parents had refused to contribute a single dime. I remembered sitting at the head table right next to her mother and father. They were stiff, unsmiling people who scrutinized every detail of the reception. But the most prominent memory I had of them was the food. The country club catering staff had been driven to the brink of madness, trying to accommodate their incredibly strict dietary requirements. Stephanie's parents are strict, uncompromising vegans. They do not consume meat, dairy, eggs, or any animal byproducts whatsoever. Furthermore, they are both severe diabetics who meticulously monitor their blood sugar levels, rejecting any dish containing refined carbohydrates or heavy starches. My eyes snapped open as the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. I thought back to the menu Stephanie had emailed to Martha. The list had specifically demanded a truffle butter-basted roasted turkey. It required individual beef Wellingtons, which consisted of heavy red meat wrapped in layers of butter-rich puff pastry. It demanded 4 different types of artisan fruit tarts, which would naturally be loaded with processed sugars and sweet glazes. She had also ordered hand-rolled pasta, which typically requires eggs and heavy cream-based appetizers. Every single item on that 16-dish menu was a direct, dangerous violation of her parents' strict medical and ethical diets. If Stephanie were truly trying to impress her hypercritical vegan diabetic mother, serving her a massive platter of roasted poultry and butter-soaked beef would be an act of outright hostility, not a gesture of love. The logic simply did not align. It was not a matter of a stressed woman making a minor mistake in meal planning. You do not accidentally order a beef Wellington for a diabetic vegan. The menu was deliberately designed for a very specific type of palate, a palate that belonged to people who indulged in rich, decadent, extravagant foods. This meant that the entire premise of the dinner was a complete and utter fabrication. Stephanie's parents were not flying in from Boston. They were never coming to Thanksgiving. The story about Stephanie crying out for maternal warmth and seeking to present Martha as the heart of the family was a calculated theatrical fiction. Thomas had lied to me. He had lied with a smooth, effortless, emotional manipulation that frankly terrified me. I felt a profound, chilling shift occur deep within my chest. Up until this exact moment, I had viewed Thomas through the forgiving, protective lens of a father. Even when he was selfish, even when he drained our finances, I had always rationalized his behavior. I had told myself that he was just a stressed husband, trying to keep a demanding wife happy, that he was simply struggling to find his footing in a competitive corporate world. But that illusion was now entirely shattered. The man on the other end of the phone was not a stressed, well-meaning son. He was a cold, calculating adversary. He had looked at his mother, recognized her boundless empathy, and actively chosen to weaponize it against her to secure free labor for a fraudulent event. If the dinner was not for Stephanie's family, then who was it for? Why were they demanding a Michelin star-level feast, and more importantly, why the absolute necessity of forcing Martha to cook it alone rather than simply hiring a catering service? They lived in a neighborhood where bringing in private chefs for the holidays was practically a status symbol. If they wanted to impress someone with a lavish meal, a professional caterer would have been the logical, stress-free choice. Forcing an elderly woman with severe rheumatoid arthritis to stand in a kitchen for 10 hours was not just cruel. It was highly inefficient unless there was a very specific reason why they needed the food to appear homemade. They were staging a performance. They needed a prop, and Martha was the perfect unwitting actor to play the role of the devoted family matriarch. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, letting the icy chill sharpen my focus. The sadness and disappointment that had weighed me down earlier completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory clarity. I was no longer an old man trying to keep the peace. I was a man who realized his home had been breached by a predator. Thomas thought he had outsmarted us. He thought that by playing on our emotions, he had successfully blinded us to the reality of the situation. He was counting on our parental devotion to override our common sense. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had forgotten that before I was a retired grandfather, I was a man who spent his life analyzing structures for hidden weaknesses, looking for the tiny invisible cracks that could bring an entire building crashing down. I looked back at the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see Martha wiping down the counters, her face still etched with the quiet resignation of a mother preparing to sacrifice her own well-being for her child. I felt a surge of fierce, uncompromising protectiveness. I would not let them use her. I would not let them turn her love into a tool for whatever deceptive scheme they were orchestrating. I knew I could not confront Thomas right now. If I called him back and pointed out the vegan discrepancy, he would just invent another lie. He would pivot, adapt, and build a new layer of deception to cover the old one. I needed hard, undeniable proof of exactly what he was planning. I needed to uncover the guest list, the motive, and the ultimate endgame of this ridiculous charade. The cold wind rustled the dead leaves across the lawn. I turned away from the house and looked out toward the city skyline. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. I was not dealing with a family disagreement. I was dealing with a coordinated deception. I needed to move very quietly. I would let them believe their plan was proceeding flawlessly. As I walked back toward the driveway, my boots crunching softly against the frozen grass, my mind began to automatically sift through the events of the past month. When you realize someone is actively deceiving you, your brain starts working backward, scanning your recent memories for the subtle red flags you previously ignored. You start looking for the out-of-place details, the slight deviations in routine that suddenly take on a terrifying new context. And as I stood there in the biting cold, a specific memory from exactly 2 weeks ago surfaced in my mind with startling clarity. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The weather had been unusually mild for early November. I was out in the backyard cleaning the gutters while Martha was inside resting her knees. I remembered hearing the crunch of gravel and seeing Thomas pull his sleek leased vehicle into our driveway. That in itself was a glaring anomaly. Thomas never visited us on a weekday afternoon. He always claimed his corporate schedule was far too demanding for casual drop-ins. Furthermore, he was completely alone. Stephanie was nowhere in sight, and he had not brought the grandchildren. He had simply shown up unannounced, carrying a half-empty cup of expensive coffee and wearing a stiff, uncomfortable smile. At the time, I had been pleasantly surprised. I thought perhaps my son had just missed us and wanted to check in on his aging parents. I had climbed down from my ladder, wiped the dirt from my hands, and greeted him warmly. He had made small talk about the weather, asked about his mother's arthritis, and casually mentioned that he needed to use the restroom. I had pointed him toward the house and gone back to my yard work, completely unsuspecting. But now, viewing that visit through the sharp, unforgiving lens of his recent lies, the entire interaction felt meticulously staged. He had not come to check on us. He had come on a scouting mission. He had known exactly where I was safely occupied outside, and he had known Martha was resting upstairs. He had the entire main floor to himself. I remembered finishing my chore about 15 minutes later. I had packed up my tools and walked through the back door expecting to find Thomas sitting at the kitchen island. But the kitchen was empty. The living room was quiet. I called out his name, but there was no response. A faint rustling sound caught my attention coming from the far end of the hallway. It was coming from my private home office. My office is a space I treat with strict boundaries. It is where I keep all our personal files, my old engineering blueprints, and our financial records. Nobody goes in there without asking, not even Martha, unless she needs to file a specific medical receipt. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As I approached the open doorway of the study, I stopped. Thomas was standing behind my heavy oak desk. He was hunched over the large fireproof filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. His back was to me, but I could clearly see that he had the bottom drawer pulled all the way open. He was actively shifting through the hanging green folders, his fingers moving with frantic, hurried precision. I stepped into the doorway and asked him what on earth he was doing. Thomas violently jumped. He physically jolted his shoulder, slamming into the desk as he spun around to face me. He kicked the heavy metal drawer shut with his heel, the loud slam echoing in the quiet room. The color had completely drained from his face, and his eyes were wide with the unmistakable panic of a man who had just been caught red-handed. For a few seconds, he could not even form a coherent sentence. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air. Finally, he swallowed hard and stammered out an excuse. He let out a nervous, breathless laugh and claimed that his phone battery was dying. He told me he was desperately looking for a spare phone charger. He said he thought I might keep some extra electronics cables stored in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It was such a clumsy, pathetic lie. At the time, I had simply frowned, told him that I did not keep phone chargers in my secure document cabinet, and directed him to the basket of cables in the kitchen. I had chalked his nervous behavior up to embarrassment. I had assumed he felt foolish for invading my private workspace. I had let it go because he was my son, and parents are practically hardwired to give their children the benefit of the doubt. But standing in the freezing wind 2 weeks later, the memory of that flimsy excuse made my stomach twist with a sickening dread. I knew exactly what I kept in the bottom drawer of that fireproof cabinet. There were no electronics, no stray cables, and nothing of trivial value. That specific drawer was dedicated to our most sensitive, highly confidential legal and financial documents. It contained our comprehensive tax returns from the last decade. It held Martha's detailed medical directives and our updated living wills. And most importantly, sitting right in the front of that drawer, in a clearly labeled red envelope, was the original finalized property deed to our home. The deed that proved we owned our $1.2 million house free and clear without a single cent of debt. Why would a corporate manager, a man who makes a living analyzing data and organizing logistics, look for a phone charger inside a locked, fireproof filing cabinet filled with legal paperwork? The answer was simple and devastating. He was not looking for a charger. He was looking at the deed to my house. He was examining the documents that proved our massive home was a debt-free asset. The pieces of this puzzle snapped together with terrifying speed. Thomas and Stephanie were living vastly beyond their means. They were drowning in the desperate, exhausting performance of presenting a wealthy lifestyle they could not actually afford. They had maxed out their credit-leased luxury vehicles and were constantly scrambling to maintain their social standing. And suddenly, Stephanie was planning a 16-dish gourmet feast for people who did not eat meat or sugar. She was demanding my disabled wife cook the meal alone to pass it off as an authentic family-centered gathering. And just 2 weeks prior, my son had sneaked into my private office to inspect the deed to my debt-free million-dollar property. They were not planning a holiday celebration. They were orchestrating a financial maneuver. They were trying to secure capital and looking at my home as a potential resource. The realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. My own son was evaluating my home as an asset for his own use. I really needed to know exactly how deep his desperation ran, and I needed to know it immediately before they could execute whatever trap they were laying. I needed to clear my head, to step away from the house and the suffocating weight of my own thoughts. I walked down the long paved driveway toward the heavy iron mailbox that stood at the edge of our property. The autumn air was sharp, biting through the thick fabric of my coat, but the cold felt grounding. It reminded me that I was still in the real world, a world governed by facts, logic, and physical boundaries, not the emotional quicksand my son had just tried to pull me into. I reached the mailbox, pulled open the creaking metal door, and gathered the thick stack of envelopes waiting inside. I stood there for a moment, simply going through the familiar mindless routine of sorting the mail. There were the usual items: a few colorful flyers for local grocery stores, a water bill, and an alumni newsletter from my old engineering college. I shuffled through them, barely registering the names printed on the front, until my thumb stopped on a thick, premium-quality envelope. It felt different from the rest. The paper was heavy-textured and distinctly professional. I looked at the return address printed in crisp, navy blue ink in the upper left corner. It bore the name of a prominent commercial venture lending firm based out of downtown Chicago. I frowned, confused as to why a high-tier commercial lender would be sending correspondence to a retired civil engineer. Then I looked at the recipient line. The letter was not addressed to me, and it was not addressed to Martha. The name printed in bold block letters across the center of the envelope was Stephanie. My daughter-in-law had received a piece of highly formal financial correspondence, and it had been mailed directly to my home address. This was not a simple clerical error. Financial institutions of this caliber do not make random mistakes with mailing addresses. They send documents exactly where the applicant tells them to send them. Stephanie had deliberately used our home address for whatever business she was conducting with this firm. A profound sense of unease washed over me, chilling me far deeper than the November wind. In a healthy family, opening mail addressed to someone else is a severe violation of privacy. It is an unspoken boundary that you simply do not cross. But we were no longer operating within the boundaries of a healthy family. My son had already crossed the line of basic human decency when he weaponized his mother's love to secure a free caterer. He had crossed an even darker line when he snuck into my private office to inspect the deed to my property. The rules of polite society no longer applied. I was dealing with a coordinated threat, and I needed to know exactly what kind of financial machinery they were trying to set into motion. I slipped the heavy envelope inside my coat pocket, placing the rest of the junk mail under my arm, and walked quickly back up the driveway. When I finally stepped back inside the house, I listened carefully. The television was playing softly in the living room. Martha had finished her prep list and was finally resting on the couch, elevating her aching knees on a stack of pillows, just as the doctor had instructed. I quietly made my way into the kitchen, ensuring that I was completely out of her direct line of sight. I set the junk mail on the counter and pulled the heavy envelope from my coat. I turned on the stove and placed our small metal tea kettle over the burner, waiting patiently for the water to boil. When a steady stream of hot steam began to whistle from the spout, I held the envelope over it. I moved the sealed flap back and forth through the thick white vapor, letting the intense heat soften the adhesive. After about a minute, the glue gave way. I carefully pried the flap open with my thumb, ensuring the paper did not tear. My hands were remarkably steady. The initial shock had entirely faded, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical precision of a man dismantling a bomb. I pulled a thick stack of folded watermarked papers from the envelope and smoothed them out flat on the kitchen island. The document on top was a formal cover letter. The header read, "Notice of Incomplete Application." My eyes scanned the dense legal text, absorbing the information with terrifying speed. The letter was explicitly informing Stephanie that her formal application for a commercial venture loan could not be processed any further until specific critical missing documentation was provided directly to their underwriting department. I moved my gaze down the page to the specific section detailing the precise financial parameters of the massive request. There, printed in stark, undeniable black ink, was the loan amount she had applied for. $3 million. I stopped breathing. I simply stood there, completely frozen in my own kitchen, staring blankly at the massive number, counting the zeros over and over again to ensure my aging eyes were not somehow deceiving me. $3 million, Stephanie, a vain woman who had not earned a legitimate, consistent paycheck in well over 10 years, was audaciously attempting to secure $3 million in commercial funding for her imaginary luxury tech startup. I looked further down the thick page, desperately searching for the exact missing documentation the commercial bank was currently requesting. The strict lender noted that because the applicant currently possessed absolutely insufficient liquid capital and severely compromised personal credit histories, the massive loan required a substantial, completely unencumbered physical asset to be legally listed as binding collateral. The entire application was completely stalled because the corporate bank strictly required the formal notarized signature of the primary property guarantor. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together with a violent, deafening clarity. Every single bizarre, disconnected event from the past few weeks suddenly formed a perfectly coherent, terrifying picture. The 16-dish gourmet Thanksgiving menu was never meant for family. It was an elaborate theatrical performance designed to impress a group of high-stakes venture capitalists. Stephanie was using my disabled wife as a free prop, forcing her to play the role of an exclusive family chef to project a completely fraudulent image of generational wealth and stability to these potential investors. But the dinner was merely the stage setting. The true sinister core of their plan was the collateral. Thomas had sneaked into my home office 2 weeks ago to find the deed to our house because they had actively listed our $1.2 million, fully paid-off property as the primary collateral for Stephanie's massive business loan. They had deliberately used our home address on the application to establish a paper trail linking them to the asset. The only thing standing between them and the $3 million payout was my physical signature on a guarantor form. If her vanity project failed, the bank would foreclose on us. My son was not planning a warm family Thanksgiving dinner to celebrate our bonds. He was actively plotting a cold, calculated, and devastating financial execution against his own parents. The sheer magnitude of this betrayal required a level of cold calculation that I had never needed to use against my own flesh and blood. I folded the thick, watermarked letter back along its original creases and carefully slid it inside my coat pocket, making sure it was hidden from view. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my racing heartbeat to steady. I could not let Martha see the panic or the rage in my eyes. I walked out of the kitchen and back into the living room, pasting a calm, reassuring smile onto my face. Martha was sitting on the couch, her reading glasses back on, painfully writing out a long list of ingredients on a yellow legal pad. I walked over and sat down beside her, gently patting her shoulder. I told her to go ahead and make the most comprehensive grocery list she possibly could. I encouraged her to write down every single item Stephanie had demanded, no matter how expensive or difficult it was to find. I told her that we would handle the shopping together over the next few days, and that everything was going to be perfectly fine. Martha looked up at me, a mixture of relief and exhaustion in her eyes, and thanked me for being so understanding. It broke my heart to lie to her, to let her continue planning for a dinner that was never going to happen. But I needed Thomas and Stephanie to believe that their manipulative plan was working flawlessly. I needed them to feel comfortable, confident, and entirely secure in their deception, so they would not see me coming. I kissed Martha on the forehead and told her I had to run a quick errand in the city to pick up some specialized hardware for a project I was working on in the garage. She simply nodded and went back to her list. I grabbed my keys, walked out to my car, and began the long drive into downtown Chicago. The highway was slick with freezing rain. The dark, unforgiving gray skies perfectly mirroring the bleak, heavy reality of what I was about to do. For 40 years, I had driven these same roads to build schools, hospitals, and office buildings. I had spent my life constructing safe, durable foundations for other people. Now I was driving into the city to deliberately demolish the foundation of my own son's life. I felt no remorse. Thomas had made his choice when he decided to put a price tag on our home and his mother's health. I navigated through the heavy city traffic, my hands gripping the steering wheel with absolute certainty. I parked in a secure underground garage and took the elevator up to the 32nd floor of a high-rise commercial building. I was going to visit my oldest, most trusted, and deeply loyal friend. Mitchell is a brilliant, relentlessly cynical attorney who specializes in corporate law and estate protection. We had known each other for over 40 years. Mitchell was the lawyer who helped me set up the contracts for my construction firm decades ago, and he was the one who meticulously drafted the ironclad deed to my house. He is a man who operates entirely on cold facts, undeniable evidence, and relentlessly aggressive legal strategy. He does not sugarcoat bad news, and he does not tolerate fools. When I walked into his opulent reception area, his assistant immediately recognized me and waved me straight through to his private office. Mitchell was sitting silently behind his massive, perfectly polished mahogany desk, carefully reviewing a thick stack of complicated legal briefs. He is 74 years old, with sharp, piercing eyes, and a demeanor that commands absolute authority in any courtroom. He looked up, surprised to see me dropping in without a scheduled appointment. He took off his reading glasses and asked me what was wrong, noting immediately that I looked like a man preparing for a funeral. I did not waste time with small talk. I pulled up a heavy leather chair, sat down across from him, and began to lay out the evidence of my son's ultimate betrayal. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the 16-dish Thanksgiving menu Stephanie had emailed to Martha. I placed it completely flat on the pristine, gleaming mahogany wood. Then I pulled out the commercial venture loan letter that had been misdirected to my mailbox. I set it down right next to the menu. Finally, I leaned forward and verbally outlined the exact timeline of Thomas sneaking into my private home office 2 weeks prior, specifically hunting for the bottom drawer where he knew the original deed to our property was securely stored. I explained the vegan and diabetic diets of Stephanie's parents, proving that the menu was a theatrical prop designed for corporate investors, not for family. I walked Mitchell through every single puzzle piece I had connected, painting the complete, terrifying picture of their financial ambush. Mitchell listened to me in absolute silence. His expression never changed, but his eyes grew darker and colder with every detail I provided. He picked up the heavy loan letter, scanning the dense, complicated legal text with the rapid, highly practiced efficiency of a veteran corporate attorney. He noted the $3 million request. He noted the requirement for an unencumbered physical asset to act as collateral. He placed the letter back down on his desk and let out a long, slow breath. He looked at me and stated plainly that my son was attempting to execute a massive, highly illegal financial maneuver that would inevitably end with the bank seizing my home when Stephanie's imaginary startup failed. He confirmed all my worst fears without a single ounce of hesitation. I looked my oldest friend directly and firmly straight in the eye. I felt a completely cold, purely mechanical detachment settling heavily over my mind. I told him that I needed to know the exact state of their finances. I needed to know why they were so desperate that they would willingly sacrifice their own parents to secure a commercial loan. I needed to know everything about their debts, their credit history, and the venture capital firm they were trying to defraud using my property as bait. I pointed to the documents resting on the polished wood between us. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of paternal weakness. I said, "Find out exactly how deep my son is burying himself, Mitchell." Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his pen rhythmically against the desk. A dangerous smile slowly spread across his face. He told me he would make a few discreet calls to his contacts in the financial sector. He promised to run a quiet, comprehensive background check on Thomas and Stephanie's entire commercial footprint. He assured me that within a few days he would have a complete, undeniable map of their financial ruin. He warned me that what he found would likely be incredibly ugly. I told him confidently that I was fully prepared for the absolute worst. I left his office feeling a dark sense of relief. The final trap was set. For the next 3 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I maintained the carefully constructed facade of an accommodating, slightly clueless elderly father. Martha spent those long days meticulously organizing her kitchen, writing out detailed preparation schedules, and finalizing her massive grocery list for a dinner that was never actually going to take place. I helped her wipe down the counters. I smiled when she excitedly told me about the specific organic ingredients she needed to buy for the truffle butter. Every time Thomas called to check in, making sure we were still fully committed to his fraudulent plan, I answered the phone with a calm, even voice. I listened to his fake enthusiasm and played my part flawlessly, assuring him that everything was proceeding exactly as he wanted. But beneath that calm exterior, my mind was entirely focused on the ticking clock. I was waiting for the phone to ring with a very different kind of call. On the morning of the third day, the wait finally came to an end. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket while I was out in the garage pretending to organize my toolbox. It was Mitchell. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply told me to get down to his office immediately, stating that he had completely finished the forensic financial investigation. His voice was grim, lacking any of its usual cynical amusement. I told Martha I had to go back to the hardware store for a missing part, got into my car, and drove straight back into the heart of downtown Chicago. The drive felt much shorter this time, my anticipation driving away any sense of fatigue. When I walked into Mitchell's private office, he was already standing by his large window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. His desk, usually covered in disorganized stacks of legal briefs and case files, was completely cleared off, save for a single thick manila folder resting exactly in the center. He turned around when he heard the heavy wooden door close, gesturing for me to take the leather chair across from his desk. He sat down heavily, folding his hands together, and looked at me with an expression of profound, quiet pity. Mitchell is a man who has spent his entire career navigating the ugliest, most corrupt corners of corporate litigation. He has seen massive companies dissolve over petty greed, and wealthy families tear each other apart for pennies. He is not easily shocked. But as he opened the manila folder, I could clearly see a genuine trace of disgust in his eyes. He told me that he had used his most reliable, discreet contacts within the financial sector to run a comprehensive, completely legal background check on the commercial footprint of Thomas and Stephanie. He explained that what he had uncovered was not just a simple case of a young couple struggling with modern inflation or a few bad investments. He described it as a catastrophic self-inflicted financial collapse. He said that my son and daughter-in-law were living inside a fragile house of cards and that the entire structure was currently collapsing directly on top of their heads. Mitchell opened the first document in the folder and turned it around so I could read the numbers myself. He stated plainly that Thomas and Stephanie were completely, undeniably broke. They did not just lack savings, they were actively drowning in an ocean of severe liability. Mitchell traced his pen along a column of figures, explaining that over the past 5 years, they had accumulated over $400,000 in high-interest consumer credit card debt. They had been systematically opening new lines of credit to pay off the minimum balances of their older accounts, trapping themselves in a vicious, inescapable cycle of compounding interest. But the consumer debt was only the beginning of their ruin. Mitchell pulled out a property valuation report for their sprawling 6-bedroom suburban mansion. He revealed that the house was severely underwater. They had taken out multiple secondary mortgages against the property to fund their lavish vacations and designer wardrobes, completely draining any actual equity they might have held. They now owed the banks significantly more than the home was actually worth on the current market. Furthermore, the luxury European sport utility vehicles sitting in their pristine driveway were not owned. They were leased, and the monthly payments were several months severely past due. Mitchell informed me that according to the commercial records, the repossession agencies were already actively preparing to seize the vehicles. The wealthy, successful, highly curated lifestyle they projected to their friends, their social circle, and to us was an absolute, complete mirage. They were entirely insolvent, living day to day on the absolute brink of total, unrecoverable bankruptcy. I sat there absorbing the crushing reality of their situation. I asked Mitchell how they could possibly hope to secure a $3 million commercial venture loan with a financial record that was completely destroyed. Mitchell nodded, anticipating my question, and pulled out the final set of documents. He explained that Stephanie, a woman who had not held a legitimate paying job in over a decade, was desperately trying to launch what she proudly called a luxury fashion technology startup. She possessed no business plan, no viable product, and no experience in the industry. However, she recognized that her carefully maintained image within her wealthy social circles was rapidly deteriorating. She needed a massive injection of capital, not to build a legitimate company, but to sustain their extravagant lifestyle and pay off their crushing debts under the guise of corporate funding. She had initially approached traditional lending institutions and standard commercial banks. Unsurprisingly, every reputable bank had taken one look at their ruined credit scores, their massive liabilities, and their lack of liquid assets, and firmly rejected their applications. They were considered radioactive to any financial institution. Driven by absolute blind desperation, Stephanie had then turned to a highly aggressive predatory venture capital lending firm. This specific firm was known for taking on incredibly high-risk clients, but they demanded absolute security in return. Because Thomas and Stephanie possessed no equity, no cash, and no credit, the predatory lender required a completely unencumbered physical asset to act as collateral to legally secure the $3 million payout. That is exactly why Thomas had violated the sanctity of my home. That is why he had sneaked into my private office and hunted for my filing cabinet. He knew that my house, the home I had built and paid off through 40 years of honest, backbreaking labor, was the only clean asset left in our entire family. His desperation to save his wife's vanity project and their fake lifestyle had completely overridden his basic morality. He was actively, consciously attempting to leverage the roof over his elderly parents' heads to fund a fraudulent business venture. If they defaulted on the loan, which their financial history proved was an absolute certainty, the predatory lending firm would ruthlessly foreclose on my property. My own son was perfectly willing to render his mother and father entirely homeless just to keep up appearances. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair across from Mitchell, letting the crushing reality of that revelation echo in the quiet office. My own son was perfectly willing to render his mother and father entirely homeless just to keep up appearances. It is a paralyzing type of heartbreak when you realize the child you raised views your life as nothing more than collateral for his own vanity. I looked at the financial documents spread across the polished mahogany desk, feeling a cold, hollow emptiness where my parental affection used to reside. I asked Mitchell how this massive predatory loan connected back to the bizarre Thanksgiving menu. I needed to understand why they required my disabled wife to cook a 16-dish gourmet feast if their ultimate goal was simply to steal the deed to my property. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, his sharp eyes narrowing. He told me that he had dug deeply into the specific venture capital lending firm listed on the misdirected mail. He explained that he had called in a few very significant favors to uncover exactly what kind of correspondence Stephanie was having with their underwriting department. What he found completely stripped away the final lingering remnants of the holiday facade. Mitchell informed me that the lending firm Stephanie had approached was not a standard financial institution. They were a notoriously aggressive, high-tier group of venture capitalists known for circling desperate startups like sharks, sensing blood in the water. They did not hand out $3 million loans based on a charming smile or a poorly constructed business plan. They required absolute, undeniable proof of elite social standing and massive financial backing. Stephanie knew that her non-existent luxury fashion technology company would never survive a traditional boardroom audit, so she had strategically bypassed the boardroom altogether. Mitchell revealed that Stephanie had miraculously managed to secure an exclusive in-person meeting with 5 of the top senior partners from the venture capital firm. But she had not scheduled this critical financial pitch for a Tuesday morning in a corporate high-rise. She had specifically invited all 5 of these aggressive, incredibly wealthy investors to her suburban mansion on the afternoon of Thanksgiving Day. The event that Thomas had so passionately described as an intimate, emotional family gathering to honor his mother was actually a high-stakes, high-pressure corporate pitch meeting disguised as a holiday celebration. I stared at Mitchell, feeling a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. I asked him why she would invite venture capitalists to a Thanksgiving dinner. It seemed entirely unprofessional and highly volatile. Mitchell smiled, but it was a cold, predatory smile that lacked any genuine humor. He explained the psychology of high-level corporate fundraising. He told me that Stephanie was attempting to execute a highly calculated theatrical performance of immense established wealth. In the world of venture capital, desperation is completely radioactive. If an investor smells that you are broke, they will either reject you instantly or bleed you entirely dry. Stephanie needed these 5 senior partners to believe that she was already swimming in generational money. She needed them to walk into her home and feel intimidated by her status. She wanted to trick these seasoned financial veterans into believing that she came from such an elite background that she did not actually need their $3 million to survive. By creating the illusion that their investment was just a casual secondary addition to her already massive portfolio, she made herself look like an exclusive, highly coveted opportunity. She was turning Thanksgiving into a carefully curated stage play to mask her absolute bankruptcy. But to pull off a theatrical performance of that magnitude, Stephanie needed the perfect props. And that is exactly where my 72-year-old wife entered the equation. Mitchell tapped his pen against the 16-dish menu resting on his desk. He explained that hiring a standard catering company is what new money does. It looks exactly like what it is, a desperate attempt to show off. But having an authentic in-house chef preparing a flawless, Michelin star-level feast entirely from scratch screams old established wealth. It projects an aura of effortless luxury. Stephanie was not going to introduce Martha to these 5 venture capitalists as her beloved mother-in-law. She was going to pass my disabled, exhausted wife off as their exclusive hired family chef. She was going to make these investors believe that sitting down to a truffle butter-roasted turkey and individual beef Wellingtons was just a standard, unremarkable Thursday afternoon at their estate. She was perfectly willing to let Martha suffer through 10 hours of agonizing joint pain just so she could play the role of domestic help in front of 5 men she was actively trying to defraud. The sheer, unadulterated indignity of their plan made me feel physically ill. My wife, a woman who had spent 3.5 decades saving the lives of premature infants and holding the hands of terrified parents in hospital pediatric wards, was being reduced to an unpaid prop for a fraudulent business pitch. I pictured Martha standing in that kitchen, her wrists swollen and burning, rolling out puff pastry, while Stephanie paraded around the dining room in a designer dress, pouring expensive wine for corporate sharks and pretending she owned the world. I pictured Thomas standing right beside her, smiling and shaking hands, fully complicit in the humiliation of his own mother. The rage that had been simmering quietly inside me finally boiled over into something dark and absolute. I placed my hands flat on Mitchell's mahogany desk and pushed myself up from the heavy leather chair. I told my oldest friend that I had heard enough. I told him that I was going to drive straight to their underwater mansion, kick down their heavy mahogany front door, and drag my son out onto the street. I was ready to tear their entire miserable house of cards completely to the ground, right then and there. I reached into my pocket for my car keys, the metal jingling sharply in the quiet office. I was entirely prepared to scorch the earth and end this deeply insulting charade. But before I could turn away from the desk, Mitchell raised his hand, his palm facing outward in a strict, commanding gesture to stop. His eyes were completely devoid of any satisfaction. He looked at me with a grave, heavy seriousness that immediately halted my momentum. He told me to sit back down. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, demanding to know what else could possibly be left to discuss. Mitchell shook his head slowly, letting out a long, weary sigh. He lowered his hand and leaned back in his large leather chair. He looked me squarely in the eyes and warned me that the guest list and the fake catering were merely the cosmetic layers of their deception. He said that we had not yet discussed the true mechanics of the trap they had set for me. He told me that there was something much, much worse. I sat back down in the heavy leather chair, the material creaking softly beneath my sudden weight. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. I looked at Mitchell, trying to process the absolute gravity of his statement. My mind raced through every possible scenario, attempting to calculate what could possibly be more devastating than using my ailing wife as an unpaid prop to defraud a group of aggressive corporate investors. For a brief moment, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over me. I felt the physical weight of my 75 years bearing down on my shoulders, a heavy ache settling deep into my bones. I felt the deep, agonizing sorrow of a father realizing that the child he had raised, protected, and provided for had transformed into a ruthless, calculating predator. But that sorrow did not last long. It was quickly burned away by a rising tide of pure, unadulterated resolve. I refused to let my son break me. I refused to let his desperate, greedy wife tear down the peaceful retirement Martha and I had spent our entire lives meticulously building. I looked down at my hands, studying the thick calluses and the faded scars that lined my palms. These were the hands that had poured concrete, welded steel, and built structures designed to withstand the brutal, freezing, unforgiving winters of Chicago. I had spent 40 years operating in an industry where weakness was immediately exploited and where simple mistakes could literally cost people their lives. I had negotiated with cutthroat contractors, navigated highly corrupt city bureaucracy, and survived brutal economic downturns that had bankrupted men half my age. I did not survive all of that hardship just to be swindled by a 45-year-old middle manager and a vain woman who played pretend on the internet. I was not going to be a victim. I was not going to be a sad cautionary tale of an elderly parent bled dry by his own offspring. I was not going to allow them to dictate the terms of this engagement for a single second longer. They had fundamentally miscalculated exactly who they were dealing with. They had assumed that because I was quiet, because I was generous, and because I was elderly, I was also incredibly stupid. They had mistaken my fatherly patience for absolute blindness. I decided right then and there that I was going to teach them a financial and emotional lesson they would never, ever forget. Before Mitchell could reach forward and open the final thick manila folder resting on his polished mahogany desk, I held up my right hand in a firm gesture to stop him. I reached into the breast pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out my smartphone. Mitchell stopped his movement and watched me in complete silence, his sharp, predatory eyes tracking my actions with quiet, intense curiosity. I unlocked the bright screen and immediately opened an airline booking application. I did not look for budget flights or seasonal discounts. I did not look for economy seating or inconvenient layovers. I typed in the destination of Maui, Hawaii. I navigated to the calendar and selected a departure date of Thanksgiving morning. I specifically scrolled through the available times and chose a flight that left the runway at exactly 5 in the morning, hours before Martha was supposed to arrive at Stephanie's kitchen to begin her forced labor. I selected 2 first-class, fully non-refundable tickets. I paid the exorbitant premium without a single moment of hesitation. I wanted the absolute luxury. I wanted the supreme comfort for my exhausted wife. I wanted the undeniable concrete finality of a financial transaction that simply could not be undone or altered. Once the airline tickets were securely confirmed and the boarding passes were sent to my email, I closed the application and opened a different one to secure our premium accommodations. I completely bypassed the standard hotel chains and navigated directly to the website of the most exclusive, luxurious oceanfront resort located on the island. I scrolled past the standard rooms and booked their premium penthouse suite, a massive opulent room with a private wraparound balcony overlooking the pristine, crashing white waves of the Pacific Ocean. I booked it for a full 2 weeks. I entered my credit card information into the encrypted form and pressed the confirmation button. watching the circular loading icon spin until the final reservation number appeared in bold, black text on the screen. The entire booking process took less than 5 minutes. In those 5 short minutes, I had completely and permanently removed myself and my wife from their manipulative board. I had unilaterally shattered their elaborate stage play without saying a single word to them. By the time they woke up on Thanksgiving morning and realized we were not coming to cook their fraudulent feast, we would already be 30,000 feet in the air, miles over the Pacific, sipping chilled champagne while their carefully constructed house of cards collapsed directly onto their heads. I locked my phone screen, the sudden darkness reflecting the grim determination in my own face. I placed the device carefully on the edge of the mahogany desk, setting it right next to the fraudulent 16-dish menu and the misdirected commercial loan letter. I looked across the desk at Mitchell, meeting his steady, calculating gaze. The deep, dark rage that had been simmering inside of me all week had fully crystallized into absolute, terrifying calm. I felt a cold precision settle over my thoughts, the kind of absolute clarity that only comes when you accept that a war is unavoidable. I leaned forward in my chair, resting my elbows on the smooth, polished wood, and spoke with a voice that was smooth, completely, even, and entirely devoid of fear. I looked at my oldest friend and said, "Whatever you are about to tell me, Mitchell, it absolutely ends today. I do not care how dark the truth is. I do not care how far they have gone to try and ruin us. They thought I was just a clueless, soft-hearted old man who would blindly sign away his life for the sake of family harmony. They thought they could use my wife as a pawn and my property as a poker chip. Let us show them what 40 years of surviving the brutal, unforgiving Chicago construction industry actually teaches a man about structural integrity and controlled demolitions." I gestured toward the closed manila folder sitting ominously between us. I told Mitchell to open it. I told him to show me the final document. I told him to show me the killing blow. I was finally ready to look the monster directly in the eye. I needed to see the absolute depths of their carefully planned treachery, to understand exactly how they intended to execute this massive, unforgivable theft against their own family. And I was entirely prepared to burn their entire operation completely to the ground today, leaving absolutely nothing behind in the ashes. Mitchell did not say another word. He simply reached out with slow, deliberate precision and flipped the heavy cover of the manila folder open. He extracted a thick stack of stapled papers and slid them across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk until they rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the header printed at the top of the very first page. It was a digital copy of a commercial venture loan application, fully processed and officially submitted to the aggressive lending firm we had discussed earlier. My eyes scanned the applicant details. The primary borrower was listed as a limited liability company registered entirely under Stephanie's name. The total requested capital was clearly stated as $3 million. But it was not the astronomical amount that made my blood run cold. It was the section located halfway down the second page, highlighted by Mitchell in a stark, glaring yellow marker. It was the section explicitly titled Primary Asset Collateral. I stared at the text, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the words printed on the page. Listed right there in formal legal formatting was the exact physical address of the home Martha and I had built together, the home where we had raised our son, the home we had spent 40 years of grueling, back-breaking labor to pay off completely. Stephanie and Thomas had formally submitted my $1 million debt-free property as the sole physical asset backing their massive corporate loan request. Because they possessed absolutely no equity of their own, because their credit was completely destroyed, and their own mansion was severely underwater. They had simply decided to use my life savings as their personal casino chip. They were telling this predatory lending firm that if Stephanie's imaginary luxury fashion technology startup failed to generate a profit, the bank was legally entitled to seize my property to recoup their $3 million investment. They were actively gambling with the roof over my disabled wife's head. If they defaulted, which their disastrous financial history proved was an absolute undeniable certainty, Martha and I would be evicted. We would be left completely homeless in our mid to late 70s, stripped of our only remaining financial security, all so Stephanie could pretend to be a wealthy tech founder for a few more months. The mechanical engineering part of my brain immediately began to analyze the structural logistics of their plan. I looked up at Mitchell, my voice barely above a whisper, and asked him how they could possibly initiate a commercial property lien without my knowledge or consent. Mitchell pointed his pen at the third page of the application. He explained that modern venture capital firms often rely on preliminary digital submissions to begin the underwriting process. Thomas had not just been looking for my property deed when I caught him snooping in my private home office 2 weeks ago. He had been actively transcribing the highly sensitive information printed on those documents. He had copied down my exact parcel identification numbers, the historical tax assessment values, the municipal deed registration codes, and the precise legal boundaries of the property. He had used that stolen, highly confidential information to populate the preliminary asset declaration forms, creating a digital profile that made it look as though I was fully cooperating with their business venture. He had constructed a flawless paper trail that presented me as a willing, wealthy, silent partner, backing his wife's ambitious corporate expansion. He had forged the initial digital authorizations using the data he stole from my fireproof filing cabinet. But a digital application is only the first step. Mitchell turned to the final page of the thick document stack, tapping the bottom corner with a grim, humorless expression. He explained that a high-tier predatory lending firm would never release $3 million in raw capital, based solely on digital forms and preliminary data entries. To finalize the transfer of the collateral to legally bind my property to her corporate debt, the bank required an airtight, legally binding physical contract. They required the actual wet ink signature of the primary property guarantor on a highly specific commercial liability release form. Without my authentic physical signature, the entire $3 million application was completely frozen in the underwriting department. The bank was refusing to release a single cent of the funds until they had that final piece of paper securely in their hands. That was the missing documentation referenced in the misdirected mail I had intercepted earlier. Thomas and Stephanie had successfully built the entire fraudulent structure, but they were missing the final crucial keystone to lock the trap in place. They needed me to unknowingly sign away my home. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, the full horrifying picture finally coming into perfect focus. The Thanksgiving dinner was not just a stage play to impress 5 wealthy venture capitalists. It was an elaborate, carefully orchestrated ambush designed specifically to extract my signature. They knew I would never willingly agree to mortgage my fully paid-off home to fund Stephanie's vanity project. If they had simply asked me, I would have flatly refused. So, they decided to steal it from me right under my nose. I closed my eyes, visualizing the sequence of events they had planned for the upcoming holiday. I saw my exhausted wife slaving away in a hot kitchen for 10 hours, pushed to the absolute limits of her physical endurance. I saw myself sitting at their lavish dining room table surrounded by corporate strangers, eating a meal that violated every dietary restriction of the guests it was supposedly meant for. And I saw my son, the boy I had loved and protected, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They needed me distracted. They needed me complacent. And they needed me feeling the warmth of family harmony so they could slide a financial death warrant under my pen without me ever bothering to read the fine print. I pictured the exact scenario my son had mapped out in his head. He would wait until dinner was over, until the heavy meal and expensive wine had dulled my sharp awareness. He would wait until I was sitting comfortably in his opulent living room, feeling the false glow of holiday contentment. Then he would casually approach me with a stack of seemingly innocuous paperwork. He would probably tell me they were just routine tax documents for the grandchildren's college funds, or perhaps some standard financial forms that required a secondary signature for a municipal rebate. He would hand me a pen, smile warmly, and point to a highlighted line at the bottom of the page, completely obscuring the dense, terrifying legal text that explicitly surrendered the deed to my property. He was counting on my absolute trust. He was counting on the fact that a father does not meticulously read the fine print when his own son asks for a quick signature on a holiday evening. It was a strategy built on weaponizing my parental love against my financial security. I was looking at a thief willing to destroy my life to preserve his comfortable illusions. Mitchell and I sat in the heavy silence of his office, the digital copy of the fraudulent loan application resting on the desk between us. I needed to understand the precise mechanics of how my son intended to actually get my physical signature on that devastating piece of paper. The answer hit me with a sickening wave of clarity as I remembered a brief, seemingly innocent phone conversation I had with Thomas just 3 days prior. He had called me during his lunch break, adopting a casual, almost bored tone. After chatting about the upcoming holiday weather and confirming what time we would arrive, he smoothly slid a minor administrative request into the dialogue. He had told me, "Dad, I have some college fund tax forms for the grandkids I need you to sign after dinner on Thanksgiving." He waved it off as a minor inconvenience, claiming it was just standard CPA stuff that needed a secondary family guarantor signature for tax deduction purposes. At the time, I had not thought twice about it. I have always contributed to my grandchildren's education funds, and handling financial paperwork is a completely standard part of my routine. But sitting across from Mitchell, viewing that conversation through the harsh lens of reality, the absolute brilliance of my son's malicious ambush became horrifyingly clear. Thomas had meticulously designed a psychological and environmental trap. He was going to use the sensory overload of a massive holiday gathering to completely disarm my natural caution. He knew that I am a meticulous man, a retired engineer who reads every single line of a contract before picking up a pen. If he had simply mailed the document to me or brought it to my house on a random Tuesday, I would have immediately put on my reading glasses, scrutinized the legal header, and recognized the commercial collateral transfer for exactly what it was. He could never get my signature in a sterile, controlled environment, so he engineered a scenario where my guard would be completely lowered. The 16-dish gourmet feast was not just to impress the venture capitalists. It was an essential component of my pacification. I pictured exactly how the evening was meant to unfold. Martha would have been awake since 4 a.m, her joints screaming in pain as she slaved away over a hot stove to produce an impossible menu. By the time the massive turkey and the intricate beef Wellingtons were served, she would be completely exhausted, physically broken, and mentally drained. She would be incapable of paying attention to any administrative tasks. Meanwhile, Thomas would ensure that I was seated comfortably in his lavish dining room. He would pour me multiple glasses of expensive, full-bodied red wine. He would engage me in easy conversation, keeping the atmosphere light and celebratory, while the venture capitalists played their part in the background. Once the meal was finally over, when my stomach was full and the wine had successfully dulled my usual sharp vigilance, Thomas would make his move. He would wait until we were sitting in the living room, surrounded by the artificial warmth of his fireplace and the manufactured harmony of the holiday. He would casually bring out a thick stack of incredibly boring, highly dense financial papers. He would place a few legitimate-looking tax forms on top of the pile, documents bearing the names of his children and the logos of recognized college savings accounts. He would point to the bottom of the pages, chatting easily about interest rates and educational tax brackets, completely overwhelming me with mundane administrative jargon. And hidden right there, buried deep within that stack of fake tax forms, would be the legally binding commercial liability release. The document that explicitly transferred the deed to my fully paid-off home into the hands of a ruthless, predatory lending firm. He would hand me his expensive fountain pen, flash me a warm, appreciative smile, and ask me to just sign the bottom line so we could get back to enjoying the dessert course. He was counting on the fact that an elderly father sitting in his son's home on Thanksgiving night, surrounded by guests and feeling the lingering glow of holiday wine, would not stop the festivities to aggressively read through 50 pages of dense legal terminology. He was betting his entire financial future on my unconditional trust. In a matter of seconds, with a few strokes of ink, I would unknowingly sign away the $1.2 million sanctuary I had spent 40 years of blood, sweat, and grueling construction labor to secure. I would hand over my life savings without even realizing a robbery had taken place. The sheer cold-blooded cruelty of this calculation was almost too massive to process. I looked at Mitchell, and we both silently acknowledged the inevitable, terrifying consequence of what would happen after that signature was captured. Stephanie's luxury fashion technology startup was a complete and utter fantasy. It was an empty shell built on vanity and delusion. She had no business model, no market research, and absolutely no capacity to generate genuine revenue. If this aggressive venture capital firm actually released $3 million into her control, that money would evaporate in a matter of months. Stephanie would immediately bleed the corporate accounts dry to pay off their suffocating consumer credit card debt, save their underwater mansion, and continue funding her lavish lifestyle of designer clothes and high-end Pilates classes. The imaginary startup was guaranteed to fail. It was an undeniable mathematical certainty. When the company inevitably went bankrupt, the predatory lenders would not go after Thomas and Stephanie. They knew the younger couple was already completely insolvent. The venture capitalists would immediately initiate aggressive collection procedures against the only solid unencumbered asset tied to the loan. They would come straight for me. I pictured the cold, terrifying reality of a foreclosure notice being nailed to my front door. I pictured bank representatives and local sheriffs arriving at my property, demanding that a 75-year-old retired engineer and his disabled 72-year-old wife vacate the premises immediately. My son was not just lying to me. He was actively, knowingly plotting to make his own parents completely homeless. He was perfectly willing to throw us out onto the freezing Chicago streets, stripping us of our dignity, our security, and our peace, just to fund his wife's delusions of grandeur. He was sacrificing our actual lives to save his fake one. The intense, burning betrayal incinerated any remaining trace of paternal hesitation inside my chest. A father is supposed to protect his child, but a man is obligated to protect his wife and his home from absolute destruction. Thomas had forfeited his right to my protection. The moment he decided to view my home as a disposable poker chip, he had crossed a line from which there is absolutely no return. The trap was meticulously designed, relying on my predictability and my love, but he did not realize I was capable of tearing his entire building down. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair across from Mitchell, allowing the crushing gravity of the massive betrayal to completely wash over me. The silence in the mahogany-paneled office was absolute, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the city traffic. I looked down at the digital copy of the loan application resting on the desk, staring at the forged preliminary details that listed my home as collateral. For the first 75 years of my life, I believed that the bond between a father and his son was an unbreakable sacred covenant. I had spent 4 decades pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into my construction firm, specifically so Thomas would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. I had paid for his college tuition, funded his extravagant wedding, and constantly bailed him out of his minor financial inconveniences. I had done everything a devoted father is supposed to do to ensure his child succeeded. But looking at that damning piece of paper, the carefully maintained illusion of my son finally died. The man who had meticulously engineered this trap was not my child. He was a ruthless parasite. What he was attempting to do was not a simple act of disrespect, and it was not a misguided mistake born out of temporary desperation. It was an act of profound, deliberate financial violence against his own family. He was actively plotting to strip away the safe, physical sanctuary where his mother rested her aching joints every single night. He was planning to steal the very foundation of our hard-earned retirement to fund a fake, shallow lifestyle that he simply could not afford to maintain. In that heavy, quiet moment, any lingering trace of paternal instinct or parental duty simply evaporated from my chest. The deep-seated biological urge to protect him, to pull him aside and desperately try to fix his terrible decisions, vanished completely into the cold air. I felt an incredible, chilling lightness take its place, the kind of absolute freedom that only comes when you finally stop holding on to a heavy, rotting burden. The forgiving father who would have yelled, cried, and begged his son to see reason was entirely gone. Thomas had killed him the very moment he decided to gamble with Martha's safety and our future. In the sudden vacuum left behind by my shattered parental affection, a cold, highly calculating mindset rapidly took over my entire thought process. I completely stopped looking at the terrifying situation through the emotional, forgiving eyes of a grieving parent mourning a lost relationship. Instead, I began to view the entire crisis through the strict pragmatic lens of a veteran civil engineer. For 40 grueling years, my job had been to assess massive, complex commercial structures for fatal hidden vulnerabilities. When you find a compromised support beam or a toxic sinkhole threatening the foundation of a building, you do not sit down and cry about the unfairness of the situation. You do not try to negotiate with the advancing robot, and you certainly do not try to cover it up with a fresh coat of cheap paint. You act with swift, surgical precision to neutralize the threat before it brings the entire structure crashing down onto innocent people. Thomas was a catastrophic structural failure, actively threatening the foundation of my family. He was a highly toxic element that needed to be isolated and completely removed from our lives. I felt absolutely no urge to confront him in a pointless, dramatic screaming match. I felt no desire to demand an apology or listen to his pathetic, manufactured excuses for why he needed to steal my property. Emotional outbursts are for people who feel powerless, and sitting in that office I was anything but powerless. I held all the detailed blueprints to his fraudulent scheme right in my hands. The intense anger that had been simmering inside me completely cooled into something infinitely more dangerous. It transformed into a consuming desire for absolute, undeniable, and surgical retaliation. I wanted to dismantle his elaborate stage play with such precise, overwhelming force that he would never be able to rebuild his illusions again. I wanted him to face the full, unmitigated consequences of his own boundless arrogance. He thought he was playing a clever game of chess with a foolish, senile old man who would blindly sign away his wealth. He did not realize he had just confidently walked onto a hazardous demolition site without wearing a hard hat. I mentally organized the exact sequence of events that needed to occur to ensure his maximum unavoidable defeat. I needed to let him build the trap, lay the bait, and happily walk his wealthy investors right into the dining room. I needed his failure to be public, humiliating, and legally catastrophic. I finally broke the long silence, pulling my gaze away from the forged document and looking directly across the desk at my oldest friend. Mitchell was still watching me carefully, his sharp eyes evaluating the distinct shift in my demeanor. He could clearly see that the grieving father had left the room, replaced entirely by a man preparing for absolute war. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any lingering hint of sorrow, panic, or hesitation. I pointed a single, steady finger at the preliminary loan application resting between us. I asked Mitchell a specific, carefully worded legal question regarding the consequences of their actions. I asked him if Thomas and Stephanie officially submit this application to the commercial lender. Using my forged preliminary details and my stolen property coordinates, does that not legally constitute wire fraud? Mitchell let out a low, rough chuckle. A slow, highly predatory smile spread across his weathered face, crinkling the deep lines around his sharp eyes. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk, and clasped his hands together. He looked at me with an expression of profound, cynical satisfaction. He corrected me immediately, his voice rich with dark, undeniable amusement. He stated that it was not just simple wire fraud. It was federal wire fraud. Mitchell explained that because the venture capital lending firm operated across state lines and utilized federal banking networks to process their multi-million-dollar commercial transactions, any deceptive digital submission immediately triggered federal jurisdiction. He tapped his expensive pen against the thick stack of papers, emphasizing his point. He told me that simply filling out the preliminary forms with stolen data was already a severe prosecutable crime. But attempting to execute the final collateral transfer, actively trying to finalize a $3 million theft using a fraudulent guarantor signature, crossed the line into severe felony territory. If they pushed this application through to the final stage, they were not just risking a massive civil lawsuit or a terrible credit rating. They were actively risking decades inside a federal penitentiary. The elaborate trap they had built for me was actually a perfectly constructed prison cell of their own making. I nodded, slowly absorbing the immense destructive power of the legal reality Mitchell had just confirmed. We had the exact weapon we needed to end them. I looked directly across the desk at my friend Mitchell, feeling the heavy certainty of our position settling into my chest. I told him in a calm, steady voice that we were not going to say a word to my son. I explained that if we confronted Thomas right now, if we drove to his house and threw these damning documents onto his kitchen counter, he would immediately deny everything. He would scramble to cancel the loan application, desperately attempt to delete the digital footprint, and spin a new web of lies to convince us it was a tragic misunderstanding. He would claim his identity had been stolen by hackers, and he would somehow try to manipulate the narrative to make himself the helpless victim. I absolutely refused to give him the opportunity to retreat into the shadows, regroup his thoughts, and formulate a new strategy to steal from us. I wanted him to step fully into the harsh, unforgiving light, completely confident in his own arrogant deception. I wanted him to pull the trigger on his own trap, entirely unaware that the barrel was pointed directly at his own chest. Mitchell agreed completely, a dark spark of approval shining in his eyes. We decided that the most devastating, effective course of action was absolute, impenetrable silence. We would let Thomas and Stephanie continue to tirelessly build their elaborate, fraudulent stage play. We would let them invite the wealthy, aggressive venture capitalists into their heavily mortgaged home, fully believing that their stolen collateral was completely secure. We would let them set the beautiful dining room table, pour the expensive imported wine, and prepare the fake tax documents intended for my signature. We would allow them to become so deeply intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance that they would completely blind themselves to the inescapable reality that they were walking straight off a sheer, jagged cliff. Mitchell immediately went to work, his fingers flying rapidly across his computer keyboard as he began to draft the final lethal countermeasures. He explained in his sharp, professional tone that he was preparing a highly aggressive formal cease and desist order alongside a comprehensive, heavily documented fraud alert package. This legal package would include the undeniable, concrete proof that my residential property had been fraudulently listed as commercial collateral without the knowledge, consent, or legal authorization of the primary deed holder. He was meticulously compiling the municipal property records, my sworn notarized affidavit, and the direct traceable evidence of the digital forgery linked to their address. But the true devastating brilliance of his legal strategy lay entirely in the precise timing of the execution. He was not going to send this massive legal strike to the venture capital lending firm right away. He was going to hold it back, keeping it completely chambered and hidden from view until the absolute perfect moment. We coordinated the exact timeline based entirely on the demanding schedule Stephanie had emailed to Martha. The corporate investors were scheduled to arrive at my own son's house at exactly 3 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. Mitchell programmed an automated, highly encrypted digital delivery system to simultaneously transmit the entire fraud alert package directly to the venture capital firm's senior underwriting department, their executive board, and the federal banking authorities at exactly 3 p.m. on the dot. The very minute those 5 aggressive corporate investors walked through the front door of that massive underwater suburban mansion, their mobile phones and corporate tablets would simultaneously light up with emergency red flag notifications from their own internal legal department. They would instantly realize that they were standing inside the home of a desperate, entirely broke couple, actively attempting to execute a massive federal wire fraud. The resulting explosion of anger and legal threats would be entirely out of our hands, handled completely by furious corporate lawyers and federal investigators demanding answers. I left his office with a profound, quiet sense of closure, the heavy burden of indecision completely lifted from my weary shoulders. The trap was permanently set, the timeline was irreversibly locked, and the devastating consequences for their greed were entirely inevitable. I drove back to the quiet, peaceful suburbs, the weak afternoon sun dipping low beneath the freezing gray horizon. When I finally unlocked my front door and walked inside, the warm house smelled intensely of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and baking bread. Martha was standing faithfully at the kitchen counter, meticulously chopping vegetables, still pushing through her agonizing joint pain to prepare for a family dinner that was ultimately destined to be a financial ambush. I took a deep, steadying breath, walked slowly over to her side, and gently took the sharp knife out of her swollen, trembling hand. I led her away from the kitchen, guided her into the living room, sat her down on the comfortable, familiar couch, and held both of her hands tightly in mine. I looked deeply into her kind, trusting eyes and told her the absolute, unvarnished, horrifying truth. I told her about the misdirected commercial loan letter I had intercepted. I told her about Thomas sneaking into my private office to steal the sensitive property deed information. I patiently explained the fake vegan menu, the aggressive venture capital investors, and the horrific reality that our own son was actively planning to trick me into signing away our home to fund his wife's imaginary vanity-driven business. I watched the color drain from my wife's beautiful face. I watched the terrible weight of that profound betrayal shatter her gentle heart. Martha wept. She cried with an agonizing sorrow that only a mother who has been sold out by her child can truly understand. She cried for the innocent boy she had raised, the boy who had mutated into a cold man, willing to leave his parents homeless for fleeting social vanity. I held her close to my chest, letting her mourn the tragic death of the family we thought we knew. But Martha spent 3 decades saving lives in pediatric trauma wards. She is intimately familiar with tragedy, and beneath her gentle exterior, she possesses a core of unbreakable steel. After 10 minutes of silent tears, the weeping finally stopped. She pulled back from my embrace, reached for a tissue, and wiped the moisture from her pale cheeks. She took a shuddering breath, and when she looked back up at me, the overwhelming sorrow in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a fierce, dignified resolve. She asked me what our next move was. I smiled, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the printed itinerary for our first-class flights and the luxury resort in Hawaii. I told her that we were going to pack our bags, leave the freezing Chicago winter far behind us, and let them face the corporate firing squad completely alone. Martha did not argue. She did not ask to give Thomas one last chance. She simply nodded, her head stood up straight, despite the lingering pain in her knees, and walked directly toward our bedroom to pack her vacation clothes. We were officially done playing the victims. Thanksgiving morning arrived wrapped in freezing darkness. At exactly 5:00, the alarm on my nightstand buzzed softly, but neither Martha nor I had been sleeping. We spent the night laying side by side in the quiet comfort of our home, the home we built, and paid for, the home our son arrogantly tried to steal. I got out of bed and dressed in travel clothes, feeling an incredible weightless energy spreading through my limbs. Martha moved with determined grace. The profound sorrow that overwhelmed her the previous evening had settled into an unbreakable fortitude. We gathered our heavy suitcases filled with warm weather clothing and bathing suits and wheeled them down the hallway. I took one last look around our cozy living room, ensuring the security system was armed. I felt a deep surge of gratitude for the sturdy load-bearing walls that surrounded us. We walked out the front door into the biting Chicago wind. A black sport utility vehicle was idling at the edge of our driveway, the headlights cutting through the thick morning frost. The driver stepped out to help load our luggage. I held the door open for Martha, and she slid into the warm leather seat with a peaceful sigh. The sky above us was a bruised purple, devoid of sunlight. The rest of the neighborhood was entirely asleep, blissfully unaware of the massive, destructive financial collision scheduled to occur later that afternoon. I climbed into the back seat beside my wife and gave the driver our instructions. We were heading to the airport, but I told him we needed to make one very brief, highly important detour along the way. The streets were deserted as we navigated through the wealthy, sprawling suburban neighborhoods. The towering oak trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching up into the freezing fog. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the exclusive gated community where Thomas and Stephanie lived. The massive, heavily mortgaged houses sat quietly behind their manicured lawns, projecting a hollow illusion of generational wealth. I asked the driver to pull over at the curb just outside my son's property and wait. I stepped out of the warm vehicle and felt the icy wind bite my coat. I walked slowly up the long, curving brick driveway, my boots making absolutely no sound on the frosted pavement. I approached the ornate mahogany front door. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not knock. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the emergency spare key Thomas had given us years ago, back when I believed he was a decent, honest man. I slid the cold metal key into the deadbolt, turned it silently, and pushed the heavy door open. I stepped into the grand, echoing foyer and quietly closed the door behind me, locking it from the inside out of sheer habit. The massive house was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the expensive central heating system. I walked softly across the gleaming hardwood floors and entered the expansive designer kitchen. I stood there for a moment, simply absorbing the scene in front of me. The kitchen was absolutely pristine. The gleaming white marble countertops were completely bare. The massive stainless steel double ovens were cold and dark. The polished chrome sink was completely empty. There were no cutting boards set out. There were no mixing bowls, no peeling knives, and absolutely no ingredients resting on the island. Stephanie had not done a single solitary ounce of preliminary preparation. She had not chopped a single vegetable or measured a single cup of flour. She was currently sound asleep upstairs in her luxurious master bedroom, entirely confident that my 72-year-old wife was going to walk through the door at 6 in the morning and magically orchestrate a 16-dish Michelin star-level feast, all by herself. Stephanie expected to wake up hours later, casually stroll downstairs in her silk robe, and find a fully catered gourmet meal ready to be served to her aggressive corporate investors. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of it was absolutely breathtaking. I felt a cold, hard smile touch the corners of my mouth. I walked over to the center of the massive marble kitchen island. I reached inside my coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. Mitchell and I had prepared it with meticulous surgical precision the afternoon before. I placed it squarely in the center of the pristine white marble. Inside that folder was a complete, undeniably crisp copy of the fraudulent commercial venture loan application. I used a bright, bleeding red ink pen to heavily circle and highlight the specific section where Thomas forged the preliminary collateral details using the stolen deed to my property. I made absolutely sure that the $3 million request and my home address were the very first things they would see when they opened the cover. I wanted them to know I had seen all their cards and that their elaborate, treacherous game was entirely over. But a legal document was not enough. I needed to leave a personal, unmistakable message. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of heavy, cream-colored stationery and a dark pen. I uncapped the pen and wrote a brief, deeply satisfying note in my clear, highly structured engineering print. I placed the handwritten note directly on top of the red, highlighted folder. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable, sitting right in the center of their home. The note was simple, direct, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. It read, "Thomas and Stephanie. Martha's arthritis is acting up today, so we decided to skip the cooking. Enjoy preparing the 16-dish feast for your wealthy corporate investors completely by yourself. By the way, my lawyer Mitchell has officially notified the venture capital firm and the federal banking authorities about your deliberate attempt to steal my house. We are currently on a flight to Hawaii. Do not call us." I stared at the note for a long moment, ensuring the ink was completely dry. I positioned the folder so that it would be the absolute focal point of the entire room. I felt a profound, satisfying sense of closure settle deep into my chest. I turned around and walked out of the pristine, cold kitchen. I moved down the hallway, stepped out of the heavy mahogany front door, and firmly pulled it shut behind me, hearing the deadbolt click securely into place. I walked back down the frosted brick driveway and climbed into the back of the waiting vehicle. Martha reached out and gently took my hand in hers, giving my fingers a warm, reassuring squeeze. I looked at the driver and told him we were finally ready to go to the airport. The heavy sport utility vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the silent, heavily mortgaged mansion completely behind us in the dark. We watched the sun slowly begin to rise over the city skyline as we merged onto the highway, painting the morning clouds in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. We were entirely free. By 4 in the afternoon, we were 30,000 feet in the air, flying smoothly over the deep blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Martha and I were relaxing in the spacious, reclining seats of the first-class cabin, sipping perfectly chilled champagne from crystal flutes. The ambient hum of the aircraft was soothing, a stark contrast to the massive explosion I knew was currently detonating back in Chicago. I had specifically paid the exorbitant fee for premium in-flight wireless internet access for this exact moment. I wanted a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of their arrogant deception. I placed my champagne flute on the small tray table and looked down at my phone. The screen was completely black, resting quietly on my lap. Then, exactly as Mitchell and I had calculated, the digital onslaught began. My phone suddenly lit up, vibrating violently against my leg. The screen flooded with a rapid, endless stream of notifications. There were dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages, and frantic voicemails pouring in simultaneously. The caller identification flashed with my son's name over and over again. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, satisfying breath, before I finally swiped the screen and answered the call. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the heavy static, and did not say a single word. Thomas was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. His voice was a high-pitched, desperate gasp for air, completely stripped of its usual patronizing corporate authority. Through the receiver, I could clearly hear the absolute unmitigated chaos unfolding in the background. I heard the sound of shattering glass as Stephanie threw something heavy against the pristine marble kitchen island. I heard her hysterical, uncontrollable sobbing echoing through the empty mansion. Thomas could barely form a coherent sentence, but the pieces he managed to choke out painted a glorious picture of absolute ruin. The 5 wealthy venture capital investors had arrived right on schedule, walking through the front door, expecting a Michelin star feast. Instead, they walked into a completely empty cold kitchen and a frantic woman having a massive psychological meltdown. But the lack of food was the absolute least of their problems. Thomas sobbed into the phone, revealing that the lead investor had received the comprehensive fraud alert package on his corporate tablet just minutes after walking inside. The investor had taken one look at the undeniable proof of the stolen property collateral, turned to my son with absolute disgust, and threatened to call the federal authorities before walking straight out the front door. Thomas wept with a pathetic, grating desperation. He cried out loudly, "Dad, you ruined us. We are going to lose the house. The police are calling me. You have to fix this." I sat back in my plush leather seat and calmly picked up my crystal flute. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid settle in my throat. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly smooth and completely devoid of any paternal sympathy. I told him I did not ruin you, Thomas. Your own greed did. You tried to make your mother a slave and make me homeless. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. You reap exactly what you sow. Without waiting for another word, I disconnected the line, opened my settings, and permanently blocked their numbers forever. 3 months later, the inevitable reality finally caught up to them. Thomas and Stephanie were forced to file for total bankruptcy. The banks foreclosed on their underwater mansion, and they are currently facing an aggressive, ongoing federal fraud investigation. Martha and I never looked back. We now enjoy our peaceful, completely toxic-free retirement together. We spend our days walking the quiet beaches and watching the beautiful sunsets, knowing with absolute certainty that we successfully protected our home and our peace. If my 75 years on this earth have taught me anything, it is that shared blood never grants anyone a free pass to exploit you. We are conditioned to forgive family at all costs, but true family protects your home. They do not scheme to steal it. When someone shows you they view you as a disposable asset rather than a human being, believe them the first time. Setting ironclad boundaries is not cruel. It is an act of profound self-respect. You owe nothing to those who would comfortably watch you drown just to keep themselves afloat. Has a family member ever tried to take advantage of your generosity for their own selfish gain? How did you put a stop to it? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of people standing up for what is right.